Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between dried herbs and herbs in a tincture form. Personally, I'm a huge fan of tinctures. They're not only easy and convenient with long shelf lives, but I feel like they really help you to get the absolute best from those herbs. So you're getting the maximal beneficial effect that you could hope to get from that herb. There's a few reasons for why I prefer tinctures. So first of all, I think that in a tincture form, because it's stored in alcohol, it's going to be really well preserved. It's going to have a really long shelf life. And throughout that shelf life, you're going to maintain the power and the efficacy of those herbs. And that's all going to be retained within that liquid. And once it's in the tincture form, it degrades super slowly compared to herbs in a dried form. You also have much less risk of contamination with herbs that are in an alcohol form, because alcohol doesn't allow the growth of bacteria or yeasts or fungi or anything like that. So generally your herb's going to be well preserved from the moment it is made into the tincture until you're feeding it to your pet. With dried herbs, you get a few disadvantages in that area. So you've got the drying, storing, sometimes poor storing and so heating of those herbs, and all of those things, including just time it's stored for, are going to decrease the potency of those herbs. And some herbs require very specific processes for their drying. So for example, lemon balm needs to be dried very quickly in order to preserve its active constituents, but also not above a certain temperature. So you can't quick dry with heat, otherwise you still lose all of those beneficial effects. It has to be done within a quick time frame, but also not over a certain temperature. So with dried herbs, if they're not dried properly or stored properly, you can lose a lot, because light exposure, the wrong temperature, too long being stored, the bag being open and so moisture getting in, all of those things can lead to spoilage of the herb. And it won't always be obvious when you're looking at the dried herb that it's had any kind of spoilage. It might look as good as the rest, but it's actually lost a lot of those beneficial effects. The other thing you can get with dried herbs, and this is obviously less common if you're buying them than if you're preserving them yourself, but it's worth knowing if you're planning on drying herbs for yourself, is that in that drying process, you've got a much greater risk of contamination than you would get with a tincture. And that could be contamination from microbes like the bacteria, yeast, fungi, or it could be from insects, because obviously if the plants are grown without chemicals, you're potentially going to have insect eggs or even actual insects that are going to be on the plant while it's drying. And obviously, if you're buying it in a supplement form, any contamination like that should have been removed. But sometimes it's not always that obvious. And it's not until the right environment occurs for those substances that they can then proliferate, and then the contamination becomes obvious. The other benefit I think you get from alcohol extracts or alcohol tinctures is that the herbs are going through a process of both water and alcohol extraction. So when you make a tincture, you have a specific ratio of water to alcohol, and the herb is steeped in that for whatever the amount of time that's required for that herb, or through whatever process it might need. And so you're getting both the water soluble components and the alcohol soluble components coming out of the herb into the liquid, so that when it's strained off, you're left with all of those great constituents within that tincture. Most herbal constituents are either water or alcohol solvent. And alcohol in particular is a really great solvent for active compounds in herbs. So using this, you're getting the most from the herb. And the only thing you might be missing is any fat soluble components, but they're less common of herbal constituents. And what you can always do is, if you're feeding the herbs to your pet, you're generally feeding it with a meal, because they're not going to eat them on their own in a tincture form. So the meal will have some fat in it, and therefore you're getting the fat going in, so you should get the benefits of the fat soluble components as well. Whereas when you're feeding a dried herb, that's obviously going into your pet's food, into their stomach. It's going to mix with whatever's inside the stomach, whatever fluids there, depending on what your pet has eaten or drunk. And then as it warms, you will start to get some of those water soluble components coming out of the dried herb. But you're never going to get any of the alcohol soluble components, because there's not going to be alcohol in your pet's stomach. So you're just missing out on this whole fraction of the herb that just isn't involved at all if you're feeding herbs in a dried form. And that's why I think tinctures give you the absolute best that you can get from that herb at any point in time. You also have in the tincture form compared to the dried form is you have a real concentration and optimization of the active constituents of the herb, which is going to give you much greater beneficial and therapeutic effects from that herb. The other advantage of alcohol extracts over dried herbs is that it's believed that alcohol extracts have the most rapid gastrointestinal absorption and the greatest bioavailability of active components compared to other forms of herbs. So not only is the tincture getting more from the herb than just drying would do, but your pet is also able to get more from the tincture than they would from the dried herb. So you're getting like a double potentization. The other big difference between the two is the dosage. With dried herbs, you can often get quite a variability with the dosage. You get quite a big range of dose. So it could be something like between, I'm going to give you some examples for, say, a 10-kilo dog, just for ease. So you could have between 1/4 and 3 grams per day. I mean, that's quite a big difference, like 1/4 and 3 grams. Like that's a huge difference. It's over 10 times, you know, so that's a big range. Whereas for tinctures, you're going to have between half and maybe 1 or 1.5 mils per day. So the low end of the dried herb range is going to be more of a supplemental dose, whereas the high end is going to be closer to a medicinal dose. Whereas tinctures, you obviously have a very small range because it's much more consistent in its potency when the herbs are in a tincture form. The other difference that you'll get between them is that obviously the other difference with the dried and the tincture herbs is that you're going to have a much more consistent potency with the tincture form, because if you think about when a plant's growing, even within the same bed that it might be growing in, say you had 100 plants in one bed, all those plants are going to have slightly different percentages or proportions of the different active constituents based on how much light they get, how much liquid they get, how much water, and how much nutrients are in their particular patch of soil. So when you're feeding a dried herb, you're getting, say, 1 scoop of the dried herb. Now, if that scoop comes from a plant that was, a bit restricted from the light, it didn't have so much water, maybe it had a big stone under its roots and they had to look further for water or for nutrients, and just might not be as good a quality. And that's why you get this big dose range, because it's not as much of a guarantee of quality. So you could feed that scoop and have very little effect, whereas another scoop could have a very high effect. And obviously the dried herbs are often mixed all together, so you will get some mixture, but it's less consistent than with the tinctures, because you're going to put all of that mixture of herbs through an extraction process together, and then you're getting that tincture form at the end. So it's much more consistent, and that's why you have a smaller range and a much more guaranteed medicinal effect, which is really what you're looking for. You want a good therapeutic effect so that you know your pet's going to get some benefits from it. And I think for me, that's why tinctures are so great. You can feed a small amount, they're convenient, they have a long shelf life, and you get the absolute maximum from your herb so that you can get your potent beneficial effects that you're hoping for. So I hope that's just cleared that up a little bit for you, and that this will make your choosing of what herbs to feed your pet much easier.